The Last of Us Part 2 was a stunning game when it launched for PS4 systems back in 2020. It was a visual tour de force, showcasing the best of Sony's first-party efforts at the tail end of the last console generation. A PS5 patch in 2021 added 60 FPS support, already making good use of PS5 hardware. But curiously, some 3 years later, we now have The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, a new bespoke PS5 version that promises visual enhancements alongside additional content. But is there really enough performance headroom for visual improvements while keeping up a 60 FPS update? And are the new content additions meaty enough to justify an upgrade for existing players? The Last of Us Part 2 has already been enhanced for PS5 systems. In May of 2021, the PS4 version was updated with support for PS5 hardware, enabling PS5s to run the game at 1440p at 60 frames per second. This new remastered PS5 release seems to promise more, so what's up with the rendering here? The basic visual setup is very familiar, at least by default. We're getting a 1440p 60 experience in the default performance mode, just like the earlier patched code. There's no signs of DRS or upsampling here as far as I can tell. Side-by-sides suggest that the two versions are a match in terms of basic image quality, with a similar, slightly soft resolve. If you look closely, you can spot some aliasing here and there, but for the most part the two releases seem perfectly fine, especially when seen from a typical TV viewing distance. By far the largest settings difference between the two titles lies in their handling of foliage. The foliage in the original code has some very obvious pop-in and level of detail compromises, showing less dense foliage at a distance that doesn't animate. On the remastered version, we don't see nearly as much pop-in during traversal, and areas distant from the camera have better foliage coverage. This extends beyond the greenery. Notice how the railing draws in on the remastered version here, for instance, but it's most noticeable on foliage elements. The Last of Us Part 2 mostly takes place in grassy outdoor environments, so these level of detail enhancements actually make for a pretty big improvement in most areas. The PlayStation Store description of the game also highlights improved shadow quality and texture quality, which are pretty tough to spot. Shadow aliasing and flicker from the PS4 release is replicated about the same here, and the presentation of shadows appears nearly identical between the two versions. This hanging container does exhibit a noticeably higher resolution shadow map on PS5, but I couldn't spot significant differences elsewhere in the game. General shadow quality appears to be largely identical to that original title, with very sparing exceptions. I captured dozens of up-close shots to get an idea of any texture resolution improvements, but I struggled to spot any differences in texture quality between the PS4 and PS5 code. The artwork was an exact match across every shot I tested, except for this shot where the dirt texture appears somewhat higher resolution in the remastered version. Like with the shadows, I wouldn't expect a wholesale improvement here, but perhaps tweaked assets show up very occasionally. Texture filtering, though, does receive a noticeable upgrade. See how distant ground detail resolves with less blur on the remastered code. Beyond those differences, I was able to spot some tweaks that seem to show up on a scene-by-scene basis. The lamp in this early cutscene, for instance, is a lot brighter in the PS5 code, which I think looks more realistic here. In the bar scene here, the patrons are properly shadowed, with what looks like capsule shadows along their feet. In a couple of gameplay scenes, I noticed that the slight depth of field effect at a distance was absent in the new version as well. Perhaps the most obvious difference is this shot in the opening cutscene, where the Ellie model appears quite different. Notice the de-emphasized eyes and different highlights on the eyes and skin, and the shot overall has been reframed. But in other flashback sequences, Ellie looks identical across the two versions. Overall, these two releases of The Last of Us Part 2 look fairly similar. Naughty Dog has definitely tweaked and touched up some aspects of the game's visual presentation here and there, but players shouldn't go in expecting a broad visual uplift relative to the patched PS4 code that we've had for the past 2.5 years. The biggest upgrade here over playing the game on a PS4 or PS4 Pro system is still the ability to play at 60 frames per second, which the remastered version and the patched version of the original both offer on PS5 systems. But there's one other visual mode here, the Fidelity mode, which should offer extra visual enhancements over the performance mode we've been looking at so far. Settings-wise, the key divide here comes down to output resolution. Fidelity mode targets a full 4K, a substantial upgrade from the 1440p resolve in performance mode, though the framerate target drops to 30 FPS when at 60Hz output. In actual head-to-heads though, I think it's not as big of an upgrade as you might expect. Both modes resolve an image that's largely free of aliasing in typical play, with higher internal pixel counts than we're used to from many current-gen titles. And from typical viewing distances, the difference between a straight 1440p and 4K isn't too profound. The 4K resolve does come with a certain clarity that the performance mode lacks, however, handing in a sharper rendition of fine details, like the blades of grass in this scene. Beyond the resolution differences, the ambient occlusion sometimes takes on a noticeably different appearance in the Fidelity mode. If you look at grass and foliage elements, these appear to have less obvious AO coverage against the ground. I don't think either is necessarily preferable over the other here though. I didn't spot any noticeable tweaks in LOD settings, volumetrics resolution, shadow resolution, texture filtering, or any other common tweakable. The two modes are essentially clones of each other, absent a slightly different foliage presentation and a bit of a delta in image quality. This is roughly what we observed in the other current-gen Naughty Dog titles as well, so there's no great surprise here. For this analysis, I replayed roughly the first 2/3 of The Last of Us Part 2 on hard difficulty to get a good sense of the typical performance players can expect, and I think the results are very good. The default performance mode offers up a smooth 60 FPS update, all throughout the content I sampled. Big firefights and wide open environments hit 60 FPS without issue, with a remarkably smooth presentation. Cutscenes are a slight exception, where the game holds a frame on camera cuts for TAA purposes. Elsewhere, the game runs at a perfect 60 FPS as far as I can tell. This was largely the case as well with the PS4 version running on PS5, which also operated at a close to locked 60 FPS. The most prominent exception was this construction site shootout sequence, as John noted in his coverage back in 2021. Here the game occasionally dropped a few frames at a time while engaging enemies. Curiously, the native PS5 version runs this sequence just fine, without any framerate drop whatsoever. The fidelity option is unsurprisingly pretty much a locked 30 FPS as well. More demanding sequences breeze right on by on the PS5 here, without any framerate dips as far as I can tell. Cutscenes are an exception again, and the 33 millisecond held frame is definitely more noticeable here than we see in the performance mode, but it's not too distracting. At first glance, it seems like there's no 40 FPS fidelity mode option this time around, but if you start the game with 120Hz output toggled to automatic in the PS5 settings, and enable the unlocked toggle in the game settings, but with VRR off, the game will attempt to render at 4K at 40 FPS. This mode actually does a pretty good job of hitting 40 FPS in typical play, with most gameplay hugging the 40 FPS line. Certain alpha effects, particularly those from infected enemies, can tank the framerate a bit at close range, and the water seems to hurt performance sometimes as well. But in general play, those issues don't pop up very much. It's definitely a better experience than the fidelity mode at 30 FPS. If you enable both 120Hz and VRR, you can play both modes with a truly unlocked frame rate, smoothed out with variable refresh. The performance mode typically seems to run around 75 to 100 FPS, while the fidelity mode seems to run around 40 to 60 FPS. Both modes appear to have identical visual settings to their 60Hz counterparts. In a game like this without dynamic resolution, I think enabling VRR makes a lot of sense, as there's usually quite a bit of performance headroom. Loading times have also seen a big improvement. In the patched PS4 code on PS5, loads tended to average around 40 to 50 seconds. Although on some occasions, I noted loads of up to a minute and a half or so. The new remastered version appears to load into chapter markers at about 16 to 17 seconds typically, which is a huge improvement. It's not an earth-shattering speed relative to what we're used to seeing from the PS5 hardware in other titles, but these loads are definitely fast enough, I'd say. Plus, once in-game, there are no loading screens whatsoever, as the game's real-time cutscenes are carefully designed to move data around as needed for future gameplay, even for the older PS4 systems. Finally, there are a couple of additional configurables worth noting. The field of view can now be modified, with a pretty decent spread between the lowest and highest values to suit different tastes. And the DualSense haptics and trigger feedback can be adjusted extensively. One interesting feature here that's turned off by default is the speech to vibrations option, which seems to basically feed speech sound waves through the DualSense haptics like a speaker, which is a cool effect. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered also includes some additional content that wasn't present in the original release. There are 3 gameplay sections that were cut from the original game, which are accompanied by in-game developer commentary. I think these are interesting additions for fans of The Last of Us, and they are in perfectly playable shape with pretty detailed artwork. Completing them all took maybe 30 minutes or so I wouldn't say that this is a long-term draw for the remaster. There's also a guitar free play area accessible from the main menu, where you can use a few different kinds of guitars, selecting chords with the sticks, and strumming with the DualSense touchpad. This is an amusing little diversion that builds on these sequences from the main game, but probably won't amount to more than a curiosity for most players. There's also a trailer for Grounded 2, a documentary on the making of The Last of Us Part 2 that will be released at some point as a special feature in the remaster itself. By far the biggest addition here is the new No Return game mode. This is a sort of roguelike horde mode spin on The Last of Us, in which the player completes short-wave-based single-player levels, building up to an ending boss battle. If you die, you have to start again from the beginning. Progress unlocks new characters and new modifiers, but everything else is reset. I enjoyed messing around here, and I think the combat fares quite well when put up against the tension of permadeath. It's not really something that I'd go back to very much. I'd probably rather just replay the main story, which has a lot of the same combat areas anyways, but I'm sure some players will get a kick out of it. Given the cancellation of the TLOU multiplayer title, this is probably the only new substantial chunk of The Last of Us game content we'll see for quite a while. Beyond the new additions and tweaks, I think The Last of Us Part 2 itself is worth revisiting for a few moments here. The game is 3.5 years old at this point, and was developed around a console that launched a decade ago, but I still think the visuals here look superb. The environmental artwork, character rendering, and animation is still top-class stuff even today, and the overall presentation here is really very striking. There are some truly stunning moments in this game. Now there are a few last-gen concessions, like a very heavy reliance on baked lighting, but the on-screen results typically look excellent. Pre-calculated lighting definitely has its limits, and the light map resolution could be higher for sure, but The Last of Us Part 2 achieves very good results here. The real-time bounce lighting from the player flashlight is a nice touch too, and gives the lighting a sense of dynamism and interactivity missing from a lot of modern titles. Reflections are handled using a mix of cube maps, which are very well aligned here, combined with screen space reflections, and capsule reflections for characters, with the occasional planar reflection in the mix as well. Ray tracing wasn't part of the original title, of course, and is absent from the upgrade package here, but The Last of Us Part 2 looks quite consistent even without ray-traced lighting. I think the game plays excellently too. The Last of Us Part 2 is an action-stealth hybrid, with the player scrounging for resources and improvising on the fly to survive combat encounters. There's something wonderfully tactile about choking out an enemy, or landing a headshot on an unsuspecting soldier. Being able to go prone and slip through gaps in buildings greatly expands player freedom in some of these combat encounters, and the gameplay arenas are large and well built. The Last of Us Part 2 also tells a unique and highly emotionally charged story, which builds on the original game without simply trying to iterate on the existing plot. I'm not going to spoil anything here, but it just feels masterfully built, from the narrative framing to the way character motivations are examined and the story unravels. And of course, it's built on a rock-solid technical foundation, with outstanding character detail and facial expression. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of my favorite last-generation titles, and more than anything else, I think this remaster is a great opportunity to revisit it, or play it for the first time. From a technical perspective, the game is in better shape than it's ever been before, and the new content additions are welcome. And this remaster is available as a $10 US upgrade for existing players, which feels worthwhile in my opinion for anyone who enjoyed the game the first time around, or $50 for new players. This isn't a full-on remake like The Last of Us Part 1, but it's not being priced at that level either. So overall, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered is a very successful, though not boundary-pushing, game remaster. This is simply the best way to play one of the most accomplished last-gen titles. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.